Hello and welcome. I'm Carolyn Grimminger with the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our program's mission is to nourish the mind and spirit and serve social justice. Our forums occur on most Sundays at noon and are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. Our church is physically located at 4700 Grover Avenue. For more information, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. Today, our speaker is church member Liz Nielsen. Liz has been a Unitarian Universalist since high school and a member of our congregation since 2010. With a background in both estate planning, law, and nonprofits, Liz has a unique perspective in advising clients who want to include charities in their estate plans. Liz received her undergraduate degree in psychology and religion with a concentration in human rights from Barnard College of Columbia University. While in college, Liz was an intern at the UU United Nations office, where she worked with UU congregations around the country as the envoy coordinator. She attended law school at the University of Texas School of Law. Okay. Before she entered estate planning, Liz served as in-house legal counsel for Southwest Key Programs, which is a large national nonprofit organization headquartered here in Austin. Liz has been practicing estate planning since 2013 and is board certified in estate planning and probate law. Her firm, Nielsen Law, focuses on estate planning for families who have loved ones with special needs, charitable planning, and probate. Today, Liz will be presenting on creating our UU legacy. Let's welcome Liz Nielsen.
Great, thank you, Carolyn, and thank you all for coming today. Just a quick summary of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk first about charitable giving and the recently passed tax reform, which I refer to as the New Tax Act. After that, I'm going to share the story of Caroline Veach and her legacy that she's left to Unitarian Universalism. Next, I'm going to talk about just how you can create your own UU legacy, before finally talking about the Wake Now Our Vision Legacy Challenge, which is a program from the UUA that matches legacy gifts to our congregation and to other UU organizations. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about why do you donate to First UU? And this is the point where there'll be a chance for audience participation. I would like everyone to think about why you donate to First UU, whether it's to the Sunday collection plate or an annual pledge. And if you don't contribute to our church, why don't you think about why you contribute to another charitable organization? I'm going to ask everyone who's here today to just write down a few words or a sentence about why you contribute. Many of you should have some orange pieces of paper and a pen, and if you don't, you can think about it. And if you're at home, feel free to participate as well. We'll take about 30 seconds, so if you would all just take 30 seconds to just write down why you donate to First UU. All right, I'm going to give you all about 5 seconds just to wrap up your thoughts. All right, so Carolyn has the mic, and so I would really appreciate if some of you would share why you've contributed to the church, and I'll start. I donate to First UU because I want my children to attend religious education classes here. Would anybody else be willing to share, please? Raise your hand.
Like to support the good work that the church does.
Great, thank you. Anybody else?
It's part of our giving is a spiritual practice, and that's it.
This church supports my values.
We need an open-minded moral force in today's society more than ever.
thank you all for sharing. It's really inspiring to hear why people donate to this congregation. However, there's one thing that I didn't hear you all say, and that's that I didn't hear anyone say that they donate to the church in order to get a tax deduction. So every year at the end of December, I make my charitable contributions. I donate to the church, to the ACLU, to the Capital Area Food Bank, and other organizations that support values that I believe in. However, every year I wait until December 31st to make those donations. And I'm not alone in my procrastination of waiting until December 31st. In fact, 50% of all charitable giving happens in the last quarter of the year. 30% of all giving happens in December. 11% of all charitable giving happens December 29th, 30th, and 31st. And December 31st is the biggest giving day of the year. So people don't give to charity because of taxes, but why are we waiting until December 31st to make our contributions? It's the last day you can make a donation and have it count for a charitable deduction for that tax year. So maybe we care a whole lot more about taxes than we care to admit, or maybe there's something else going on here. I was a psychology major in undergrad, and I really focused on what motivates people to make decisions. And there is a behavioral economist named Dan Ariely, who's a professor at Duke, and he did a study on procrastination. And in this study, there were two groups of students. These students were enrolled in a semester-long MBA class at MIT. They were executive MBA students. So that means they were professionals. They were not people coming right out of undergrad. And in this semester, all of the students were required to write 3 papers over the course of the semester. In group 1, the professor gave the students deadlines, and those deadlines were evenly spaced over that semester. In group 2, the students were able to give themselves the deadlines for submitting the papers, and there was no penalty for submitting them all on that last day. However, the students were required to announce at the beginning of the semester when their papers were going to be due, and there was a penalty if they submitted them late. So what group do you think got a better overall grade in this class? Not too surprising, group 1, the group that had the extrinsic deadlines, not the group that was able to do their own self-imposed deadlines. So how does this apply to charitable giving? And it's because just as deadlines are really important for getting good grades in college, they're also really important for charitable giving. December 31st is an extrinsic deadline set by the IRS that requires us to go out and make our charitable donations. And under the new tax law, that deadline is going away for most taxpayers. And that's because fewer people are going to receive a charitable deduction for their annual charitable giving. So let's talk a little bit more about the new Tax Act and how it's going to affect charitable giving. So it's going to affect charitable giving in 2 ways. It's likely going to have a very negative impact on annual charitable giving, and that's because, as we discussed, under the new Tax Act, fewer people are going to be itemizing. Due to the doubling of the standard deduction, the $10,000 cap on state and local deductions and other changes, it's expected that the number of people who itemize is going to go from, it was 30% in 2017 to about 10% in 2018. And if you don't itemize, you don't get any charitable deduction for charitable giving. And this is going to have a disproportionate effect on the people that contribute to charity. And that's because itemizers currently provide about 82% of charitable giving, or $239 billion annually, whereas people who don't itemize tend to have lower incomes, and they, as a consequence, only provide about 18% of total charitable giving, or $53 billion. So the reduction in the number of people itemizing, that reduction from 30% down to less than 10%, is going to have a disproportionate effect on the people who give to charities. And again, what happens if you don't get a charitable deduction for your donations? That deadline goes away. And as we talked about, people aren't very good at setting deadlines on their own. According to the Council on Foundations, the passage of the new Tax Act is expected to result in a decrease of $16 to $24 billion in charitable giving every year. So the Tax Act is going to have another effect on charitable giving. It's likely to have a really negative effect on legacy giving to charities. The new Tax Act doubles the size of the estate that's subject to federal estate tax. It's going from about $5.5 million per person in 2017 to over $11 million per person, or that's over $22 million for a couple in 2018. And the estate tax provides a very strong incentive for the very wealthy to give very large charitable gifts. Eliminating that incentive for all but the very most ultra-wealthy is likely to have a substantial decline in the kind of substantial gifts that can really be transformational for charities, churches, schools, colleges, hospitals, and the arts. The best evidence we have of this comes from a recent year where there actually wasn't any estate tax, and that was the year 2010. In 2010, when there was no estate tax, charitable bequests dropped by 37% from the previous year. And then when the estate tax was reinstated in 2011, charitable bequests increased by 92%. So while now the estate tax hasn't been completely repealed, it affects less than 0.1% of all estates. And further, now that the estate tax really is not part of the estate planning conversation for most families, many estate planning attorneys like myself are never going to talk to their clients about charitable giving. And that's because when most estate planning attorneys were trained, we were taught to really talk about charitable giving as an alternative to paying estate tax. And now that really nobody is going to be paying estate tax, this is just not coming up in the estate planning conversation. And so the overall bottom line is that the new Tax Act is going to be really bad for charitable giving, and that's both for annual charitable gifts and for legacy gifts. As an estate planning attorney, I feel that I have a responsibility to address this issue, not just with my own clients, but with other estate planning attorneys as well. I've started writing articles and speaking to groups of estate planning attorneys about this issue. Estate planning attorneys are really well situated to talk to their clients about charitable giving, and yet few do. And that's because they're uncomfortable talking to their clients about charitable giving outside the context of taxes. In the year 2000, Scott Fithian wrote what is really the preeminent book on advising clients on charitable planning. And this book was called Value-Based Estate Planning. And it's still the book that everyone talks about when you talk about charitable giving. In the book, he provides a blueprint for establishing a client's planning objectives, referred to as the planning pyramid, which we have up here on the screen. The planning process is really driven by three objectives, according to Fithian. At the bottom, we have the desire to achieve financial independence, and that's at the base of any estate planning conversation. Up next, on top of that, is the desire to leave a legacy for your family. And then finally, at the top, we have the social capital legacy, and so that's charitable giving. And this was a much easier conversation to have back in the year 2000. In the year 2000, the estate tax exemption was $675,000 per person. Contrast that with the $11 million we have now. So back in the year 2000, it was often a conversation of you can leave your family legacy up to the $675,000, and then above that, you have a choice. You can either give to charity, or you can leave a portion to the government in the form of estate taxes. And that wasn't that difficult of a decision for most people. Now that the exemption is over $22 million for a couple, exceedingly few clients will ever have to make the choice between estate tax and charity. And this changes the conversation, and it changes it from talking about taxes to talking about how large do you want that family legacy to be, and then how can you include charity above that. And Not surprisingly, I've learned that by just talking to my clients about whether they want to include a charity in their plan, a lot of clients do want to, and often it's a significant gift. And that's true whether they have a very small estate or a very large estate. People still want to give to charity even when taxes are taken out of the equation. Just as when we all talk about why we contribute to the church, it's not because of taxes. We do it because we want to promote our values and pass our values on to future generations. And so by recognizing that many clients have a desire to leave a social capital legacy, and then actually talking to your clients about charitable giving, estate planning attorneys like myself are not only helping our clients achieve their legacy goals, but we're also helping our communities. As Unitarian Universalists, we have an incredible example of someone who left a social capital legacy to our faith that has not only allowed Unitarian Universalism to survive, but to flourish. And this is the legacy of Caroline Veach. And up here we have a picture of Caroline Veach in the foreground and her husband, Arthur Clifford Veach, in a painting in the background. Caroline Veach was described as a modest woman. She actually never set foot in a Unitarian church, and yet her contribution to our faith has been immeasurable. She grew up in rural Indiana. She married her husband, Arthur Clifford Veach, in 1902. They traveled around the country and then even to Europe before they ended up settling in Long Island in New York. And the two of them, they never had any children. So we'll start our story with talking about Arthur Clifford Veach. So this was Carrie's husband. He was a geologist. And after they got married, they moved to Louisiana. And while he was there, he did research on these things called salt domes. And so up here on the picture, we have a picture of Arthur Clifford Veach on the left. In the center, he wrote a lot of reports as a geologist. He was pretty well published and pretty well respected as a geologist. And then on the right, we have a picture of what is a salt dome. So a salt dome is this structure under the ground, and Arthur Clifford Veach in his research, he realized that the presence of these salt domes meant there was likely to be really valuable mineral interests in the ground. And so he learned about these salt domes in Louisiana, sort of on the border between Louisiana and Texas. And then as part of his job, he worked for Sinclair Oil Company. They sent him to Germany, and he went there in 1926. And when he was there in Germany, he realized that they also had these salt domes. And he thought, gosh, that seems like it would be a really good idea to invest in these mineral interests. So he asked his employer if his employer wanted to buy the mineral interests. And they said, no, that didn't seem like a very good investment at the time. I think that there was some political issues happening in Germany. And so they declined. And so he decided to purchase these mineral interests. And important to our story, he purchased some overriding royalty interests. And what that is it's an interest in the production of the mineral interest. So once the minerals are actually taken out of the ground, it's a percentage of the production value of those interests. So after he returned to Long Island in 1933, he watched the progression of Hitler, and needless to say, he saw no profit from his oil interests in Germany. He died in 1938, and he left his entire estate to his wife, Carrie, including the royalty interests, which were essentially worthless. Fortunately, Carrie, she didn't need to rely on the inheritance from her husband, which was quite small, because she had inherited enough from her father to live what seems to be a quite comfortable life there on Long Island, which was good because she suffered from spinal arthritis, so she wasn't actually able to even leave her home. She was bound to her wheelchair. All right, so here we have a picture of Caroline Veach, and she lived with her sister, Della. Her sister never married and was really a caretaker for Carrie. Carrie's physical therapist came to visit her, and her physical therapist was a Unitarian. And at the time, there was a church that was getting started. The Unitarian Society was just getting started, and they were just seeking contributions from members in the community of who they thought might be sympathetic to the cause. And so the physical therapist asked Carrie if she would make a small donation, and she did. She had a reputation for contributing to organizations that her friends felt passionate about. So she made a small contribution. And as a result of this gift, the local minister, this is Gerald Wary, he visited her to express his gratitude for that gift since she wasn't known to be a Unitarian. He really enjoyed that visit, and Carrie, who wasn't able to get out in the community, she also enjoyed visiting with him. And so he began visiting with Carrie and also with Carrie's sister Della on a regular basis. And he would visit them about every 2 weeks for the remainder of Carrie's life. Carrie was very interested in what was going on at the church. And Reverend Wary, he loved talking about his church and what was going on there. So back then, there wasn't YouTube to allow you to watch sermons if you weren't able to make it to church. And so instead, they circulated printed copies of the sermons. And so Carrie received these sermons. She loved reading them. She also loved reading the weekly church newsletter that Reverend Wary put together, which seems like it included a lot of details about what was going on at the church. So she read the sermon, she read the church newsletter, she got really involved in what was going on at the church. And actually, upon her death, her sister gave Reverend Wary a complete file of every single sermon and newsletter that she had received. So it was clear that this was something that was very important to her. And as a result, she started making contributions to the church. And her contribution started small. She donated Yule logs to the church for the church Christmas party. She donated some furniture for its first building. She made annual contributions to the church. She donated to the Unitarian Service Committee to support some of their work in Czechoslovakia at the time. She contributed to the church's building campaign when a larger church building was needed. And here we have a picture of Reverend Wary. He's on the right, and this is at the cornerstone laying of that new church building that she helped contribute to. After about 3 years of learning about the church and beginning to make these small contributions, she told Reverend Wary that she would like to, as she put it, remember the church in my will. And at that time, she also signed the membership book. She asked Reverend Wary if he knew an attorney that could help her update the documents, and he was able to put her in contact with a member of the church who was a partner in a large New York law firm, and he helped get her documents updated. A few years later, she told Reverend Wary that these oil interests in Germany had started producing, but she couldn't get those proceeds out of Germany. This was in post-war Germany, and it was really hard to convert the German marks into US dollars. And so she told Reverend Wary if he could figure out a way to get that money out of Germany, she would give half of it to the church, whatever he got. So Reverend Wary, he thought, okay, I'll make a go at getting those royalty interests out. And so he found a lawyer and an international banker who was able to get those first oil royalties out. And the first royalties were about $7,000, and Carrie, true to her word, gave half of those to the church. She received a few more royalty interests over the next year or so, and she continued to give half of the royalty interest payments to the church, which was beyond her original agreement with Reverend Wary. And this got him thinking. Reverend Wary was not like us estate planning attorneys that are a little hesitant to talk to our clients about charitable giving. He thought, gosh, if she's giving these, maybe she wants to continue giving the half of the royalty interest to the church, and maybe after she passes away, she would want to give all of these interests to the church. And so he approached her about this, and she said, yes, that's exactly what I would want to do. And so she worked with that same attorney that she'd worked with originally to set up a trust. And the terms of this trust said that during her lifetime, half of the proceeds would go to the congregation, and then after she passes away, all of the proceeds of the royalty interest would go to the congregation. And she was thinking that this was not a large part of her estate because they weren't producing that much, and so she wasn't thinking that this was going to end up being as important as it was. So unfortunately, Carrie, she died from cancer in 1953, and at that time, she left half of her estate to the church and half of her estate to her sister, and all of these underlying royalty interests to the North Shore Unitarian Society. So here we have some pictures of the North Shore Unitarian Society. On the left, we have the original church. That was the church building when Carrie was involved in the congregation. And then on the right, we've got a picture of, it's now called the Unitarian Universalist Congregation at Shelter Rock, and that is their very beautiful campus there on Long Island. The value of those overriding royalty interests that we talked about, it was not huge at first. In the late 50s, right after Carrie passed away, they were in the neighborhood of about $25,000 annually, and they increased to about $50,000 in the early 60s. However, by the 70s, they increased to over $10 million a year, and they peaked at about $20 million a year. So this was a lot of money for that congregation to receive, and the congregation was really smart and put it in what's called the Veach Fund. And this is a foundation that is used to support Unitarian Universalism. At first, the funds were really used to make loans and gifts to other Unitarian congregations, as well as modest gifts to the American Unitarian Association and the Unitarian Service Committee. So those are the precursors to the UUA and the UUSC. As the Veach Foundation was getting off the ground and those royalty interests were growing like crazy, the UUA actually found itself in dire financial straits. And the Veach Foundation was able to support the UUA during this difficult time, saved the UUA from bankruptcy at least twice, and then also gave money to the Beacon Press to cover the costs of publishing the Pentagon's papers, which is a whole nother story, but a very important contribution. So it's true that our faith would not be what it is today, and indeed it might not even exist at all if it had not been for Caroline Veach's legacy. UUA past President William Sankfort has said, "The impact that Shelter Rock and Veach have had on this movement has been transformative. I don't think there is any doubt that their generosity contributed significantly to the turnaround that has placed the association where it is today so that we can build on strength rather than weakness." Total grants in 2017 exceeded $12 million. 1/3 of that was used to support Unitarian Universalism, and 2/3 to support UU values and sustain the fabric of social justice organizing in our community. Nearly $1 million was given to each of the UUA and the UUSC, over $1 million to the Unitarian Universalist funding program, and that's the grant-making arm of the UUA. $175,000 was given to the Beacon Press, and then there are maybe 50 or 100 smaller grants that Veach gives out to promote UU values in our community. And up here I have the logos of 3 of those, and that's because there are 3 that happen to be located here in Austin. And just to give you an example of what these grants are for, $50,000 went to the Progressive Technology Project to increase the technology resources available to grassroots organizing groups and to promote their strategic use for progressive movement building. $40,000 to the Workers' Defense Project to organize low-wage workers to protect their rights and affect public policies and corporate practices, and $20,000 to the Funders Committee for Civic Participation. $20,000 to increase funding for nonpartisan civic participation and to educate funders so their civic participation grant-making more effectively strengthens the progressive movement for social justice. And actually, I'm here today in large part because of Caroline Veach. When I was in college, I was an intern at the UU United Nations office. And I remember when I went to the first day of my internship, I walked into this building. It's the one up here on the right. It's called the Church Building. And the building, it's right across the street from the UN. And in it, many different religions have their UN offices. And so I walked in there and I tried to find our UU United Nations office, and I walked over to the elevators, and that wasn't going to get me there. Someone finally directed me to some back stairs to go down to the basement, walk down a really thin, dark hallway, and into what was basically a large storage closet. And that was our UU United Nations office. It's since moved up. It's a little bit higher. It has some windows now. But when I first started there, it was basically a storage closet. But a very important part of having a UU presence at the UN was having a United Nations office. And I remember when I was there was always this amazing funding source called the Veach program that was paying our rent. And if it hadn't been for the Veach program paying the rent for that little tiny storage closet, we literally would not have had a Unitarian Universalist United Nations office. And if I hadn't had an internship at the UN, I very likely would not have gone to law school. I was studying psychology and religion, which, if you put those together, I kind of was taking the path towards becoming a minister until I went and had that internship at the UN and realized that really my passion was in law. And so I went to the University of Texas, brought me here today. So I think there's a lot of people for whom without Caroline Veach and her legacy, they wouldn't be where they are today. In the Veach Foundation's 2017 annual report, they said, "We hope you will remember that Veach funding has, for generations, sustained the fabric of social justice organizing in our country. The UU congregation at Shelter Rock has long stood up to fear and isolation. Through Veach's long-term core support of those most directly impacted by injustice, we stand with our partners in philanthropy and with the hundreds of organizations we have supported." And that's quite a legacy. And it's a legacy that was part of a journey that began with a small funding request from Carrie's physical therapist to her church, a journey that continued as Reverend Wary visited with Carrie and told her about what was going on at the church, a journey that continued when she began to make annual contributions to the church and contributed to the church's building campaign, and finally decided to remember the church in her will. When she originally approached Reverend Wary about including the church in her will, she said, "I like what the church is doing, and I believe that a splendid future lies ahead for it." And because of her bequest, a splendid future did indeed lie ahead for both the UU congregation at Shelter Rock and for Unitarian Universalism. And it's in this spirit of not just hoping for, but actually creating a splendid future that we should all consider what we want our UU legacy to be. I'd like you all to go back and think about what you wrote down as the reason that you give to our congregation. You can use this to inspire your legacy. And just as Caroline Veach's legacy started small, with a small contribution to a fledgling congregation, your legacy can start small as well. You can start by getting involved in the activities of the church, whether it's coming to the Public Affairs Forum or going to the Women's Alliance or other events here at the church, or joining a committee and getting more involved in church life. You can get involved in the church and begin to create your UU legacy that way. You can donate on Sunday mornings to the collection plate, whether it's $5 or $20, those donations really do add up. You can make a pledge to the church, and a pledge is where you're saying in advance what your annual gift will be for the following year. And I want to stop and just talk about a couple of smart tax ways that you could make your annual gifts, especially in light of tax reform now that you may not be getting that charitable deduction that you used to get. And one option for that is what's called bunching your charitable gifts. And so this works especially if you tend to make fairly substantial charitable gifts, but you're not quite up to the level where you're going to be itemizing. The idea is that if you make all of your gifts in one year, and then there's a few years where you don't make gifts, you can bunch your deductions into the 1 year when you will end up itemizing. And this is a concept that's probably a good idea to talk to your accountant about, but I think it's really an important thing to think about. And there's a couple of ways that you can do that bunching. One option is just making a larger gift than normal in that year. I think if you do that, it's a really good idea to tell the organization that's what you're doing so that it's not going to mess up their budget and they don't begin to rely on these extra large gifts. You also could do something like prepaying your pledge. So you could pay your 2018 pledge and then prepay your 2019 pledge, and so you're bunching those two pledges into 1 year. Or you can make a gift to what's called a donor advised fund. And a donor advised fund is basically an account that you can set up with Fidelity or with a community foundation. And this allows you to make a gift to it in 1 year and get the full tax deduction in that year. And then you can spread your donations out over the course of the next several years. Another way to get some really good tax benefits for annual charitable giving is called the IRA charitable rollover. And so this really only works if you're over 70 and a half, you have an IRA, and you're taking out required minimum distributions. But if you are, there's a specific part of the tax code that allows you to pay those required minimum distributions directly to the charity. And so if you do that, the charity never has to pay the income tax on it. And so that RMD is worth more to the charity than it is to you. And so you're basically getting the maximum tax benefit of that gift. And so if you already make the charitable gifts, you have an IRA, you're over 70 and a half, this is a really smart way to make your annual charitable gifts. Okay, so other ways you can contribute to the church. You can contribute to the capital campaign. So just as Carrie contributed to the building campaign at her church, this is a really valuable way to make sure that our church will be here and be large enough for future generations. You can give to other causes that promote UU values in our community. And then finally, you could include our congregation in your estate plan. And here I want to talk about, again, a couple of smart ways to do this. And one of them is related to naming a charity as the beneficiary of your retirement plan. So if you have a retirement plan, if you name a charity as the beneficiary of that, those proceeds are worth more to the charity than they would be to an individual beneficiary, whereas most assets are worth the same to the charity as they are to other beneficiaries. And this is because the church is never going to have to pay the income tax on those retirement plan assets, whereas individual beneficiaries, they'll have to take out required minimum distributions and pay income tax. And so if you have a retirement plan and you want to make a gift to a charity, for most people, the most tax-efficient way to do that is by naming the church or another charity as the beneficiary of that retirement plan. Let's see. All right, and then we'll talk about the Wake Now Our Vision Legacy Challenge, as this is another way to really maximize legacy gifts. The Wake Now Our Vision Legacy Challenge is a collaboration of the UUA, the UUSC, our two theological seminaries, that's Meadville Lombard and Starr King, the Church of the Larger Fellowship, and the UU Ministers Association. And so they all got together and put together this Wake Now Our Vision Legacy Challenge. And the goal of it is to strengthen the future of Unitarian Universalism through planned giving. And it's the belief of all of these organizations that planned giving has a potential to transform our faith. So what is the Legacy Challenge? So what it is it's a $5 million grant from the UU congregation at Shelter Rock. When you hear UU congregation at Shelter Rock, that's Caroline Beach. So a $5 million grant that's going to provide a 10% match for new legacy gift intentions for the benefit of the Wake Now Our Vision collaborative campaign partners, as well as UU congregations. And so they're going to be matching some legacy gifts. And what's a legacy gift? That's where you're leaving something to the church or to one of these other entities after you pass away. And if you leave something to the congregation or to the UUSC or another one of those organizations, they're going to receive a 10% match. And that 10% match is limited to $10,000. That's the cap for it. But that match will happen either 2019 or 2020. So you get the legacy match now, and then the church will also get your legacy gift after you pass away. So it's a really, really good campaign. So how exactly does it work? And we've got 3 steps. The first step is you have to actually make a legacy gift. So you can do this. It can be as easy as updating the beneficiary of your retirement plan or life insurance policy, and you can often do that online, and it's very straightforward. You can also update your will or your trust and name the church as a beneficiary. After you've made your legacy gift, then you need to complete a pledge form. And this form is pretty straightforward, but you just list on there sort of what's the value of your gift, and then you also have to send in a copy of either the beneficiary designation form or the pages of your will that show that the church is a beneficiary. And then you should also let the church know that you've made this legacy gift, and so the church can make sure that we're getting the proper payments, matching grant. And then after that, we've got the gifts now and later. The gift now is that 10% match, limited at the $10,000, and then the gift later is really going to help fund the future of Unitarian Universalism. And that's really what's so transformative about this program. So we've got a quick example. So Penny, it's my daughter's name, Penny updates the beneficiary of her retirement account so that the First UU Church of Austin will receive 50% of whatever's left after she passes away. The current value of her IRA is $100,000. She completes the Wake Now Our Vision form and sends it to the UUA along with a copy of her beneficiary designation. The church will receive $5,000 in 2019 due to the 10% match. And then let's assume that Penny uses some of her retirement account. It's only worth $50,000 when she passes away. The church is going to receive $25,000 at that point. And so that's sort of a general idea of how it works. I want to kind of talk through a couple of variations on this. So what if Penny had already named the church as a beneficiary of her retirement plan or in her will? That's okay. The rule is it counts as a new legacy gift intention as long as you haven't officially told the church about it. And so if you've already done this, chances are very good you can still qualify for the match. What if Penny's married and she wants her husband to be the primary beneficiary and she wants to name the church as the contingent? That's okay too, according to the UUA, as long as the church is, that first contingent after the spouse. It will still count for the match. What if instead of retirement, Penny had a life insurance policy? That's okay, and it's even okay if it's a term policy. So as a parent of young kids, I have a 20-year term policy that will go away in 20 years. It still will count if I name the church as the beneficiary of that term life insurance policy today. So that's generally how it works, and there's a deadline for this. So the sort of official line is that new legacy gift intentions made between January 1st, 2017 and June 30th, 2020 will count for the match. However, it's expected that the matching funds will be fully utilized by the end of 2018. So there's only $5 million in matching. So once that $5 million is gone, then there's no longer going to be a match available. So here at our church, we've got a different deadline. Our deadline is going to be June 17th, which is a mere 2 weeks away. And so what is going to happen on June 17th is after both of the services, we're going to have a table where we'll be able to help you complete the form if you've already updated your estate plan or named the church as a beneficiary of your retirement or life insurance. So we'll be able to help you fill out the form, make copies if you need copies, and get everything mailed off to the UUA. If you've completed your will using the Giving Docs platform, we'll help coordinate witnesses and a notary, so those wills can at least be signed correctly. As an estate planning attorney, I've probated a lot of DIY wills, and I've never probated one that didn't have problems. Often major problems, but the most common situation I see is where they're not signed correctly. Here in Texas, it's really important for wills to be signed in front of 2 witnesses and a notary. When I did a sample Giving Docs document, it said that the notary is optional. And while that might be true under the letter of the law, it's going to add a lot of stress and expense to your family, and it certainly would outweigh any benefit of not going out and finding a notary. So highly suggest that if you're doing the Giving Docs, you make sure it's signed in front of a notary. But going back to Wake Now, Our Vision Legacy Challenge, as an attorney, I think that this is a really innovative campaign, and one that I've actually been telling other estate planning attorneys about as a way to maximize large charitable gifts, both for people who are contributing to organizations that may already have a legacy challenge in place, but also people who want to make that large $5 million contribution. By making it in the form of a legacy challenge, it's going to be, basically making it a tenfold impact on that organization, because that $5 million grant from the Veach Foundation is going to be worth $50 million in legacy gifts. And so it's a really fantastic way to make your large charitable contributions as effective as possible. I think that the program's really innovative for 3 ways. One, I think it provides a deadline. We talked about how deadlines are important. People probably aren't going to be changing their will and including the church just because of the legacy match and that 10% match. But just like students who got the deadline from their professor to complete their papers, having a deadline for completing your estate plan or updating your beneficiaries is really important, that extrinsic deadline of when it needs to get done by. I think that it also gets people thinking about their social capital legacy. Just as I found when I asked my clients if they want to include a charity in their plan, they're a lot more likely to actually include a charity. This is the same thing. Just by talking to people about including the church as a beneficiary is much more likely that people will actually do that. And finally, I think it's a really savvy way to achieve Caroline Veach's vision of a splendid future for our congregation and for our faith. I think it really builds on her legacy, and her legacy wasn't just those mineral interests. During her life, she followed and contributed to her church, from reading the Sunday sermons to supporting the building campaign, and then finally leaving a legacy gift to her church. The Wake Now Our Vision Challenge really builds on this legacy and inspires all of us to create our own UU legacy. So please consider what you want your UU legacy to be, and consider both the small and large ways that you can pass your UU values on to future generations. And that's all that I have on this. I think we have some time for some questions, if anyone has any questions.
All right, we have about 12 minutes for questions.
Okay.
If you'd stand up, please.
How hard is it to change your beneficiary designation on these different, like if I have an IRA or if I have a 401k or
That's an
insurance policy?
good question. And so it's really dependent on the policy itself and how it's set up. Most of the time, it's as simple as just going online and updating your beneficiary designation. I will say that if you are changing it so that, for example, an IRA is going to your spouse to going 100% to another person or to a charity, that can cause some problems. But beyond that, if it's going to your spouse and then to the charity, or you aren't married, it's very straightforward. And you'll just want to make sure that you are designating the entity correctly. Often you need to include the tax ID number for the entity, but it's usually very simple. You can do it online. Sometimes you might have to sign something and mail it back in. The trick will be for the Legacy Challenge is just making sure you have a copy of whatever it is that you're submitting that can show that the church is a beneficiary.
Yes, my question has to do with the final destination of the 10%.
Yes.
Who is the beneficiary, and to what extent can we designate the beneficiary? For example, our congregation here versus the national organization.
So that's a good question, and there's a couple of kind of caveats. So if you are just naming the church as the only UU organization that's the beneficiary of your will or your retirement, then the 10% match will go entirely to the church. to our congregation. It goes to our congregation as unrestricted funds, and so you can't designate that it's going to go to one particular part of our congregation, but it will go all to our congregation. If, say, you've included both the church and the UUSC as beneficiaries in your will, then that match could it can go 50% to the USC, 50% to our congregation, depending on how you have it set up in your will, but in the same proportions. I recently helped a member of our congregation who was leaving significant amounts to both our congregation and to another UU organization, enough that it would fully utilize the 10% match since it's capped at the $10,000. And so, in speaking with her, she said that she wanted the full match to go to our congregation since she was giving enough to our congregation to maximize her gift. And so what we did was we filled it out and then we sent to the UUA just the provisions that said it was going to our church. And so that way she was able to direct the full match to go to our church while still, including other UU organizations as beneficiaries.
Since this is all about taxes and IRS, and I already should know this, however, that is for 2018, what is the standard deduction amount that you'd have to exceed for charitable deductions?
That's a good question. Don't quote me on this, but I think it's around $28,000 is the standard deduction. Yeah. For a couple, yeah.
The tax cut was rapidly pushed through, so was this an unintended consequence, and is there any chance that it might be revised?
That's a good question. I think it is in some ways an unintended consequence. I think especially as it relates to churches and hospitals and the types of organizations that are generally important to everybody. I think that the estate tax component of it, I don't think that was really, I think that the goal might be to completely repeal the estate tax, and so I think that was more of a compromise. As far as annual charitable giving, I don't know. I think it is unintended, but I'm not sure it's something that's going to go away because I don't know how they could really get it back in there the way that the tax code's written. Because even though you're not getting the charitable deduction, you're still getting a deduction equal to what the charitable gift would have been. So at the end of the day, your taxes are going to be the same.
If there are any more questions. Doesn't look like there's any more questions.
Okay. Well, thank you all for attending today. And please let me know if you have any other questions. I'm happy to answer them or
Just stay after.
yeah, stay after. All right.
Thank you, Liz, for the presentation. Let's give her a hand.
Thanks, everyone.